Today on the Dig In podcast, I'm joined by Dr. John Day, Emeritus Professor of Old Testament Studies at Oxford University, with doctorates from both Cambridge and Oxford. He spent over 40 years at the forefront of biblical scholarship, and his groundbreaking book, Yahweh and the Gods and Goddesses of Canaan, represents 25 years of research into one of the most controversial questions in biblical studies. What if ancient Israel didn't start out monotheistic? That Yahweh was originally just one God among many in the Canaanite pantheon. Today, we're exploring how the God of Israel emerged from and ultimately transcended the polytheistic world of ancient Canaan. We'll discover what Yahweh borrowed from gods like El and Baal, how goddess worship like Asherah fits into the story, and how true monotheism was finally achieved during the Babylonian exile. This is the real historical journey from many gods to one God. Now it's time to dig in. Welcome, everybody, to the Dig In podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Ova, and today I have the privilege of having Dr. John Day join us today. Dr. Day, thank you so much for your time today. Looking forward to this very interesting topic.
It's a pleasure.
So, before we dive into Yahweh specifically, can you paint us a picture of the religious landscape of ancient Canaan? What gods and goddesses dominated this world that the Israelites emerged from?
Yes. Canaan, and in fact, all the other nations of the ancient Near East were all polytheistic, worshipping many gods and goddesses. But very often these nations would have a supreme or national god. For example, in Moab, the chief god was called Chemosh, in Ammon, Milcom, and in Edom, Kaus. And in Phoenicia, which is really a northern part of Canaan, a part of Canaan that the Israelites didn't possess the people, Baal was very much the chief god there. It's too simplistic to say, as people often did years ago, that Yahweh was a god of history and other gods were simply nature or fertility gods. That's quite wrong. There was a Swedish scholar, Bertil Albrechtsson, wrote a book called History and the Gods, in which he showed that the gods of the other nations around were also thought to act in history. And of course, Yahweh was also thought as a nature god and creator and thought to bring fertility to the land. Egypt also had a large number of gods and goddesses. It was only the pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BC, husband of the beautiful Nefertiti, who tried to abolish all the gods and establish monotheism, but it only lasted a few years, and when he died, all the old gods came back, Similarly, Mesopotamia was modern Iraq, ancient Babylonian, Assyria was also polytheistic. Now, if you're asking about Canaan specifically, forgive the irreverent comparison, it's a bit like God the Father and God the Son. El was the supreme god, sort of Baal was where all the action was, the son of El, and also a dying and rising god like Christ. Now, El was thought of as supreme and creator and wise. And that's why the Israelites were quite happy to equate Yahweh with El. When the people came into the land, they equated Yahweh with El. Even though Baal was abominated, El was thought to be a good fellow and was equated with Yahweh. So El is the most important, is the supreme God. And we learn a lot about El from the Ugaritic texts. Ugarit is a site on the coast of northern Syria, now called Ras Shamra. And in 1929 onwards, many mythological texts were found which tell us a lot about the religion of Canaan, far more than the Old Testament does.
Interesting.
So we learned that El was the supreme god, but Baal was the most active god, a dying and rising fertility god. He was thought to be dead during the summer months, when it was all dry and not a drop of rain. The weather forecast in Israel and Syria, that area, every day is no change from April to October. I know because I spent a whole year and a quarter of my life in Israel and Palestine 50 years ago. Shows how old I am, 50 years ago, when I was a fellow of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. But Baal was thought of as rising from the dead in about September or October. That's when the rain comes. for about 6 months on and off, not every day, but, for about 6 months. The Bible talks about the former rains and the latter rains. And that's
Right.
why many Israelites were tempted to worship Baal. It was thought that was his special area of expertise, bringing rain and fertility to the land.
Right.
But there were other deities. El had a wife called Asherah, or Atheret in Ugaritic, but Asherah in the Old Testament. And Baal had various wives. One was called Astarte, you will have heard of. Another was Anat.
Mm.
But there were also other deities. There was Mot, the god of the underworld and death, who swallowed Baal up when it was time for the dry season to come. There was a god Resheph, who was another underworld deity who is mentioned in the Old Testament as a rather kind of demonic kind of figure in the book of Job and in Habakkuk 3. And there's Molech, who was a rather grisly god to whom human sacrifice was offered. The Ugaritic texts don't mention human sacrifice, but they mention a god, MLK. They didn't write the vowels, you see, who seems to be equivalent to Moloch, whose worship was centered in the valley of Hinnom, which is by Jerusalem. Well, it's now in Jerusalem, but in ancient times it was thought to be outside Jerusalem.
Right.
Well, that's something about the religion of Canaan.
No, it's fascinating because I'm, trying to get into the mindset of the ancient Jews, specifically of the Old Testament, just to kind of feel where they were at and how much, and talking from as a Christian, how much we really don't know about their mindset in regards to what's taught in the church. That's why having you on as an expert in this field is always going to be enlightening. One of the verses that popped out to me is Deuteronomy 32:8-9, where it's in the Song of Moses. And it seems that those two specific verses describe Yahweh receiving Israel as his portion from the Most High. What are we actually witnessing in terms of ancient divine hierarchy? I know you touched on that a little bit, but it seems like there was some type of ancient hierarchy back in that day.
Yes. Well, that is a very interesting text, which I was intending to discuss anyway, as it states that the Most High divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God. Now, would you believe it? The Jews thought there were 70 nations on earth.
Okay.
And El, the supreme Canaanite god, had 70 sons. So when it says in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, that Most High divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God, it's quite clear that the sons of El in Canaanite religion have been appropriated by Yahweh. They're now his sons. These sons of God. They're mentioned various times in the Old Testament, like a pantheon of gods which are under Yahweh, and Yahweh is supreme, but they're sort of underneath him, the sons of God. But as monotheism became absolute, eventually, from Deutero-Isaiah onwards, these gods became thought of as angels. That's where the angels came from. So the book of 1 Enoch, late book of 1 Enoch, talks about the 70 guardian angels of the nations, not simply the 70 gods. Now, you mentioned about Yahweh receiving Israel as his nation, just as other gods receive their nations. Some people think that in this text, the Most High is distinguished from Yahweh. And when you first hear it, it sounds as if that might be the case. That may be the case, but I personally think Yahweh is equated with the Most High here. They're different names for the same God. Because everywhere else in the Hebrew Bible, the Most High is an epithet of Yahweh.
Right.
In Psalm 46, Jerusalem is a city of the Most High. So that's an interesting verse. I think Yahweh, you see, I believe in origin was a god of Mount Sinai, which was probably in northwest Arabia rather than where tradition put it in the south, because it's associated with Midian and Edom. Or if it wasn't in northwest Arabia, it was in very northeast of the Sinai Peninsula. Anyway, Yahweh came from there, and he was brought in, I believe, by a Moses group. I don't think all of Israel had been in Egypt, but a small number Moses brought out. And he introduces Yahweh into Canaan, and that's where Canaan, Yahweh becomes equated with El. And although Yahweh takes over the sons of El, who become the sons of God, he rejects his wife. Some Israelites worshipped the goddess Asherah,
Yeah, that's
alongside
wild.
Yahweh. It's
That's
quite
wild.
clear because you read 2 Kings 23, we know that Asherah was even being worshipped in the Jerusalem temple. King Josiah in 621 BC abolished her cult there. Why would people worship this goddess? Well, it makes sense if Asherah was the wife of Yahweh for some Israelites, not for the Hebrew Bible, not for the Old Testament, which
Right.
rejects this as an abomination, but there
Right.
were Israelites who thought Yahweh had a wife. That explains Deuteronomy 16 verse 21, which says you shouldn't plant an Asherah tree next to the altar of Yahweh. Well, why would anyone do that? It makes sense if she was thought of as Yahweh's wife. And I don't know if you know, there was some years ago, there was a text in Hebrew found at Kuntalit Ajrud in the north of the Sinai Peninsula, referring to someone saying, I bless you by Yahweh and his Asherah. So they're clearly connecting Yahweh and Asherah. Now, the Old Testament rejects that, but, there were many Israelites who who did.
Yeah, because
So
it seems
some
like
centuries worship Yahweh alongside Asherah.
I was gonna say, it seems like in the Old Testament where it mentions where Asher is worshipped, it's condemned, right? Like it's not
Of
looked at
course,
as a
yes.
good thing. It's
Oh,
looking
yeah.
at like, yeah. But there is evidence of a sect of ancient Judaism that did worship
Yeah,
Asher.
well, we probably shouldn't use the word Judaism. That's a term usually used for the post-exilic religion. Say the religion of Israel, the earlier period,
Okay,
or the religion of
interesting.
the Hebrews. Yeah.
Okay,
Um,
why do we see the name Israel, which contains El and not Yahweh, if Yahweh was always their God?
well, that's a very interesting point, isn't it? The name Israel probably means El will rule. It's like God rules, okay,
Yeah,
God
yeah.
rules,
God
or El
rules.
rules. And I can't explain why they put El in the name rather than Yahweh. But you see, because El and Yahweh became equated, to say El rule, it meant Yahweh, you see. So it's just another term for Yahweh, it became. So
Right.
in much of the Old Testament, the name El is no longer a Canaanite god. It's just another name for God, like
Interesting.
Elohim, another word,
Yeah.
which is the plural of El. Now, you might wonder why a word for God will be in the plural. I don't know if you know Hebrew. Elohim is a plural word.
Yep. I
It's
don't.
what's thought to be a plural of excellence. Like
Hmm.
in the book of Proverbs, Chokmah, wisdom, is sometimes spoken of in the plural, Chokmot. It's a way of speaking about something being excellent. Anyway, I hope I haven't
No, that's great.
gone too far from your question, but
So when El, is there like a pinpointed time when El turned from a Canaanite god into the god of?
well, if you think well, if you I mean, I think there was an exodus of a small number of Israelites into Canaan via Mount Sinai. I personally would date it about 1200 BC. And so from that period onwards, I suppose Yahweh and El will become equated in my view.
Okay.
And the sons of El will be taken over the sons of God. But, is what's called the Yahweh alone party. The Yahweh alone party would obviously reject Asherah and
Right.
Baal and all the other Canaanite gods,
Right.
but some of the other gods will be seen as his underlings, like his heavenly court. Just as an earthly king has a court, so Yahweh as a great king would have a court,
Right.
of gods later
Right.
understood as angels.
So back to Baal now. Now Baal was a major competitor to Yahweh in the biblical narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What specific attributes and powers did Yahweh absorb from Baal, and what was consciously rejected?
Well, I suppose Yahweh is very much a storm god in the Old Testament. I mean, but maybe that was before they came into the land. Think on Mount Sinai, the theophany on Mount Sinai, Yahweh appears in the storm. So maybe that wasn't appropriated from Baal.
Right.
Um, um, I don't know if a lot was appropriated from Baal. It was mainly from El, because Baal was rejected, you see.
Right. Right.
I mean, Baal is a dying and rising god. Yahweh was not thought of as a dying and rising god. But there were some Israelites who equated Yahweh with Baal. We know that from the prophecy of Hosea. It's in chapter 2, verse 5, that Yahweh or the prophet says, you shall no longer call me my Baal. Now, as you know, people don't condemn things that aren't being done. So it's quite clear some people were equating Yahweh with Baal
Wow.
as opposed to El. And the prophet rejects that. So Baal, everything to do with Baal has negative overtones.
Yeah.
Now, Baal had, well, we know of two wives from the Ugaritic text, Astarte, called Ashtoreth in the Old Testament, and Anat, also mentioned in the Old Testament. Like there's a place, Beit Anat, meaning house of Anat. And so it seems that some Israelites did take over Baal's wife. That explains why there's a place called Elephantine. It's a site in the south of Egypt near modern Aswan, where there was a Jewish colony in the 5th century BC. And this colony, although this is the post-exilic period, they didn't only worship Yahweh. They mainly worshipped Yahweh, but they worshipped a few other gods and goddesses as well. And one was called Anat Yahu, which means Anat. Yahoo is funny like Yahoo, Yahoo.com. Anat Yahu was the wife of Yahoo there, or Yahweh. There was another goddess, Anat Bethel, another wife of Yahweh, presumably. So Anat lived on in Egypt amongst the Jews there in the post-exilic period. But it may be that the Jews there were really from the northern kingdom. The fact that Bethel comes in the names of two of the deities, Anat Bethel and Anat Bethel and Herem Bethel, this would fit if the people there came from the northern kingdom, because Bethel, you see, was in the northern kingdom. Right. And you may recall it was at Bethel where there was a golden calf, which the Old Testament abominates, as a pagan symbol. But it's quite probable that those who put up the golden calf saw it as a symbol of Yahweh. There is in Samaria, in the northern kingdom, an ostracon, that means a potsherd with an inscription, from the 9th century, which actually has the name Eglial, which means calf of Yahweh, suggesting that the calf was seen by some as an acceptable symbol of Yahweh, as it was for El, and also for Baal, by the way. But, the Old Testament rejects that.
Right. Fascinating. Very fascinating.
Yes. Next question.
Yeah, sure. Now I want to turn to some of the mythological figures that you've written about, like Leviathan and Behemoth, being borrowed from Canaanite sources. How did these cosmic battle myths get incorporated into Yahweh's identity as a divine warrior?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I should have mentioned Leviathan when talking about absorbing things from Baal. Because in the Ugaritic text, we don't get a long description, but it is stated at one point that Baal defeated the 7-headed serpent or dragon called Leviathan. And in the Old Testament, it's Yahweh who defeats Leviathan. You find this, for example, in Psalm 74, when speaking of creation, it talks about Yahweh shattering the heads of Leviathan. This is in connection with the creation of the world. It's in Psalm 74, verse 14, I think. And in Isaiah 27, verse 1, this is projected into the future. On that day, it means at the end, Yahweh will slay Leviathan, the twisting and crooked serpent, and slay the dragon that is in the sea. Now, would you believe it? Those very same terms, crooked serpent and dragon, are used of Leviathan in the Ugaritic text. So clearly Yahweh has appropriated Baal's role there. And in the New Testament, you might be interested to hear, in the book of Revelation, remember there's a dragon with 7 heads in Revelation 12, symbolizing Satan. And you've written on Revelation, so you know all about it. And in Revelation 13, there's the beast with 7 heads, symbolizing, I believe, the Roman Empire. Now, this is clearly taken over ultimately from Leviathan, the 7-headed Canaanite monster. So it's taken over by the Old Testament, and kind of somehow it lived on and reappeared in the 1st century in the book of Revelation in a kind of an apocalyptic eschatological future sense, as in Isaiah 27:1, which is quite fascinating. Just as you remember, Jesus is accused of casting out demons by Beelzebul. Not Beelzebub, that's a later corruption. Beelzebul, and Beelzebul means Prince Baal, would you believe it? It's an epithet of Baal in the Ugaritic text, except it's the other way around, Zubul Baal, Prince Baal. So in New Testament times, it's used there as a term to describe Satan. Which is quite remarkable. And somehow, this 7-headed dragon and Beelzebul, they must have gone underground for several centuries because I think Beelzebul, is only mentioned somewhere in the book of Kings, I think, centuries earlier. Then suddenly, you get it reappearing in the 1st century in the New Testament.
Right.
So Some of this
Yeah.
imagery went underground a bit, it seems, and kind of emerges. Of
Yeah.
course, we're also limited in the sources we have. There's a lot more was written in the ancient world than we possess. So that's
Sure.
why very often we have to speculate.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. You argue that true monotheism doesn't emerge until the Babylonian exile. Can
That's
you?
my personal view.
Yeah. Can you trace for us the journey from polytheism through henotheism or monolatry to absolute monotheism?
Yes. This is a tricky subject,
Okay.
and we don't know all the details precisely, and different scholars might hold slightly different views. But I would say that in ancient Israel, in the pre-exilic period, that's before the Babylonian conquest in the 6th century, in the century preceding that, many Israelites probably worship other gods in addition to Yahweh. This is clear from the condemnations of the prophets. The prophets are constantly condemning the people for idolatry and worship of other gods, so that's pretty clear. But already in the 9th century BC, the prophet Elijah confronted King Ahab and the people and saying, you must either worship Yahweh or worship Baal. He didn't think it was acceptable to worship both, which is probably what many people were doing. So we can tell that already in the 9th century BC, there was what you might call a Yahweh alone party that insisted on worshipping only Yahweh. It's what we call monolatry rather than absolute monotheism. Or
Okay.
one scholar called it practical monotheism. It's and well, you remember from the Ten Commandments, you shall have no other God before me. That's not the same as saying no other God exists.
Yeah.
Psalm 95 refers to Yahweh as a great king above all gods. He's a king over them, but he doesn't deny the existence of other gods. The Yahweh alone party, who may have been a minority at first in the pre-exilic period, they would have been monolatrous rather than absolutely monotheistic. And the tendency towards monolatry was encouraged by King Josiah's reformation. This is an important event. 621 BC, King Josiah, king of Judah, he abolished all the local shrines, what the Old Testament calls the high places, because they were built on high places. He abolished them all with their cults.
Literally high places, right? Like literally.
Yeah, they were. Yes, that's right. Yes, not that high, but pretty high. And it seems that these high places had what's called syncretistic worship. Now, the word syncretistic means mixing up of religions. So the worship there would have mixed up the religion of Canaan with the religion of Yahweh. And we read that in 621 BC, Josiah abolished all their cults and insisted that everyone came to the Jerusalem temple to worship. But it's a bit off-putting. You've got to go all the way to Jerusalem. I know Israel's quite a small country, but I mean, insisting, I suppose they weren't going every week like church, sort of main festivals. This reform of King Josiah is described in 2 Kings 22 to 23. Now, interestingly, his reformation also involved the abolition of pagan cults going on in the Jerusalem temple. And 2 Kings 23 mentioned this involved the cult of the god Baal, the goddess Asherah, and the worship of all the host of heaven, all the stars and the sun and the moon. So all their cults were abolished in 621 BC. So king, you see, kind of had absolute power then. But the worship of the god Moloch in the valley of Hinnom was also abolished by King Josiah. This cult I mentioned earlier involving child sacrifice. Now, you may wonder, why would people offer up children to a god? Well, I think it's a case of desperate measures for desperate times, because it seems to predominate in the 8th and 7th centuries when the Assyrians were sort of rather dominating the land, and perhaps it was a way of encouraging the god to be, to make things better for them. Anyway, this obnoxious cult was abolished by Josiah 621 BC. Then the exile comes along. The Babylonians conquered Jerusalem first in 597 and then again in 586. And that's the really big event when the temple gets destroyed and the kingdom comes to an end for a few decades.
Sure.
And the prophets of that time tended to see the exile as a judgment on their sin. So they thought they better do better in future. So this leads to a strong tendency within the exile to try and be more faithful to Yahweh, and this continued in the post-exilic period after the return from exile, which the Persian king Cyrus, allowed the Jews to return. Now, there was a prophet towards the end of the exile called Second Isaiah or Deutero-Isaiah. That means the author of Isaiah 40 to 55. If you read these chapters, it's clearly not written. These chapters aren't written by the Isaiah of Jerusalem, because they presuppose now that Babylonia is the chief power, and the Jews are suffering under them, many of them in exile. Quite different from the beginning of Isaiah, where Assyria is the leading, is top dog, like your country, America, top dog,
Right.
or top god. Sorry, top dog, yeah. Now it's Babylonia. Anyway, in these chapters, Isaiah 40 to 55, the prophet called Second or Deutero-Isaiah by scholars seems to insist that only one God exists. One verse is Isaiah 45 verse 5. He says, I am the Lord and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. And you can find similar sayings elsewhere within his prophecy. Now, believe it or not, there are some scholars who think even this may not be absolutely monotheistic. There are some scholars who think maybe the prophet is simply saying Yahweh is the only God of any importance, the only God who acts, and so on. But I personally think that the prophet is absolutely monotheistic, and he couldn't have made it any clearer, and that has been the traditional view. So after Second Isaiah, we're now in what's called the post-exilic period, or what Jews often prefer to call the Second Temple period. And it seems that many of the people now probably were monotheistic. This tendency may have been encouraged by Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah were leading Jews, in the Persian Empire. They were leading Jews who, for example, they forbade mixed marriages of Jews, between Jews and foreigners, which wasn't for racist reasons, but to try and maintain the purity of the religion.
Right.
So this certainly encouraged monolatry. There wasn't much scope for the religion of other peoples to interfere with the Yahweh religion. By the way, the Canaanites were long gone, so they're in the past now. However, archaeology has revealed that there's a site in southern Egypt, I mentioned it earlier, didn't I? Elephantine, where there was a Jewish colony. I think they were guarding the southern border of the Persian Empire. And they did worship Yahu, as they called it, alongside a few other goddesses like Anat Bethel and Anat Yahu, and also a god Herem Bethel. Now, Anat, you may recall, had been the wife of Baal in Canaanite religion, so it seems to be a kind of a relic of that. Somehow it's turned up here at Elephantine amongst the Jews. But even so, the Elephantine papyri, they're written in Aramaic, there are many of them. They suggest Yahu, that's Yahweh, was very much the chief god, and these other deities don't play very much of a role. So that's how I basically see the development from polytheism to monotheism. But for the Old Testament itself, of course, this is the religion of Israel as it was. But the Old Testament itself, of course, in the pre-exilic period is thoroughly monolatrous. No other gods are to be worshipped. And as I said, from Second Isaiah onwards, we seem to probably have absolute monotheism. But the religion of Israel isn't always the same as what you find in the Old Testament. As you know, the prophets are constantly criticizing the behavior of the people and their unfaithfulness. That's basically how I see it.
When Second Isaiah declares that I am Yahweh and there is no other, I am God, there is no other, how radical would that have been? Was it the majority that were more monolatrous versus monotheistic?
Well, it probably was a radical thing to say, to deny the existence of other gods altogether, if my interpretation and the generally accepted interpretation is correct, that it is a denial of other gods altogether. It would be quite radical. And sometimes people ask me, well, why would this suddenly happen in the exile when the Jews were in exile? Well, it could be, I suppose, that since they think they've been unfaithful before the exile, and that's why they're sent into exile, they thought they'd better be good boys and girls in future and and sort of go to the other extreme and deny the existence of other gods altogether. We don't really know. There are many things we don't know for sure, you see.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it seems like that's where we're turning. I just pulled up this verse real quick because I just saw it in 1 Corinthians 8. It says, "We know that there is no such thing as an idol in the world, and there is no God but the one." Where it seems like it was making that stark turn to, now we're in the New Testament. Now we're seeing Paul in his letter in 1
Yes.
Corinthians. There's only one God. There's no other gods that exist. Seems
Yes.
like to be the
Oh,
majority
yeah. By the
mentality.
way, I wanted to say something about idols and images.
Okay.
I don't know if you know Second Isaiah. He very much
Very
parodies
little.
idol worship. He says, a man makes a god out of one bit and he burns a fire with another bit of the wood. He makes it sound a really stupid thing to be doing. Um, but for those who did worship idols, it seems as if they didn't think they were worshiping merely a piece of wood. They thought that the spirit of the god, although it was transcendent in heaven or whatever, the spirit of the god they worship was present in the image. That's the way they saw it.
Interesting.
I thought might interest you.
Yeah, definitely.
And another thing I should mention is even in the pre-exilic period, it's very difficult to find any evidence of any image of Yahweh. It does seem as if there must have been a deep-seated tradition that you don't make images of Yahweh, because it's difficult for anyone to find anything that could be an image of Yahweh. There was another thing I also wanted to mention, is that I didn't mention about Hebrew personal names. Hebrew personal names from the pre-exilic period, both from the Old Testament and from Hebrew inscriptions, there aren't very many which have names of other gods apart from Yahweh in them, or El, who means Yahweh. It's only a minority have names of Baal, although there are quite a lot in the Samaria ostraca from the 8th century. Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, there are quite a number there. But it does seem as if, I don't think this proves that most people only worship Yahweh, but it means that Yahweh was very much the supreme and chief God, I think, even for those who worshipped others, going by the personal names. And it's the same for both the inscriptions and the Old Testament itself. They both seem to be of that kind. But, the Baal does appear in some names. Saul had a son called Eshbaal, didn't he, called Man of Baal, for example. And sometimes, of course, when they referred to Baal, they may have been meaning Yahweh by equating them, the sort of thing Hosea condemns. So sometimes it may be Baal in addition to Yahweh, sometimes perhaps equating them.
Trying to even frame this how I see it in America anyway, and on the state side, in operation, it's almost like this battle still takes forward, right? You have, as a Christian, you have some Christians that teach a very, again, monotheistic view, like where there is one God, he rules and reigns, and that's that. There are no other gods. But then on the flip side, with a lot of these, I guess, deliverance ministers, where you see binding and casting out of things like Jezebel and Baal, and the idea is that these are demons that possess people. And we see that a lot in America too, where they still claim monotheism, but yet it's almost like when they're mentioning there's this whole underworld or whole thing, it's a polytheistic type of view, at least in my vantage point of viewpoint anyway. Any thoughts on that?
I think people who believe in angels and demons, which Christians traditionally did, and many maybe still do, don't see them as gods. They may be gods in origin, but they've been demoted. They're subordinate. They're on a lower level than God.
Wouldn't that be just a name change to make you feel better, though?
They're on a lower level. I mean, they're not supreme. And of course, with regard to demons, I mean, many Christians would say that some of the things that the New Testament attributes to demon possession is simply some kind of psychological illness, because in that period, they thought demons actually caused mental illness and epilepsy and things like that, which, on the other hand, I know some Christians, especially in America perhaps, who believe demons literally exist. Right. Was that all, or you've got some more things?
I just got two more questions for you. All right. Dr. Day, after 40 years of studying these texts and traditions, how has understanding this evolutionary process actually enriched rather than diminished your appreciation for biblical tradition and the emergence of ethical monotheism?
Well, I think I would say that studying, I'm now 77, believe it or not, but in perfect health, and I've been studying the Bible since about the age of 10, I suppose,
Wow.
which is about 67 years, perhaps. I was brought up in a very evangelical church, very conservative evangelical church that maintained there were no errors whatsoever in the Bible. The Bible is an infallible book. There are many people like this in America, as you know. But that was the kind of church I was brought up in. And I found this, as I studied the Bible and studied it critically and actually read it, there's a lot of fundamentalists don't actually read the Bible. They say it's an infallible book, but if they read it, they would soon see that it wasn't. So over the years, as I studied the Bible and read books about it, I concluded that the Bible is not an infallible book. So I had to revise my views about the Bible. I'm a Christian. I'm devoted to Christ, and I see a progressive evolution towards Christ within the beliefs within the Bible. So I came to see it's not all on one level not on one level. There is development of belief. For example, Psalm 88 implies that the dead don't praise God, whereas the New Testament would say they do.
Right.
There's a development there over time, the belief in life after death. Or in the Old Testament, you get many passages which show hatred of enemies, and Jesus said we shouldn't hate our enemies, but love them. So there you see a development. So my views of the nature of the Bible have been transformed, and I think have come towards a more true and honest picture. Now, Jesus, according to John 14:6, said he was the way, the truth, and the life. So I very much think reverence for truth is important, whether we like it or not. We may come across things that maybe challenge our original beliefs, but I believe in making our religion fit the facts rather than trying to make the facts fit the theology. So I suppose theologically you would probably say I'm some kind of a liberal, but that doesn't mean to say I'm faithless. I have a genuine belief in God and Christ. I think study of the Bible, it means maybe one might believe less, but perhaps come to believe what one does believe more intensely. I don't know if you find, but I certainly think study of the Bible, it brings one to a more honest picture of what actually happened, as opposed to what the preacher in the pulpit might tell us to believe.
Right. It's so good.
And that's one of the things I would say. And I would say that, supreme truth is found in Christ, and he is the criterion by which we should judge other things in the Bible, whether they're true or not. Though I think Jesus himself, as a first century Jew, was in some sense also a man of his time in certain ways. Otherwise, he couldn't really communicate with human beings of the first century if he knew what we all knew about space and, so he probably thought, there was believed in a 3-decker universe. I mean, that's what people did at that time. If he didn't believe in those things, he wouldn't be truly human, would he? So I'd say that study it hasn't removed faith, but it's led to a revised version of it.
I love it.
And I think it's very important that we're honest.
I agree.
And seek the truth wherever it leads.
You can't deny facts to try to fit that around your faith. Yes. You have to have your faith. You have to get your facts from your faith should stem from the facts. You have it has to be that way. So
I would see ultimate authority in religion as coming partly not only from the Bible but also from reason. The Church of England, traditionally, which I'm a member of, for better or worse, the Church of England, I mean, it talks about 3 authorities, Bible, reason, and tradition. Now, I don't pay much attention to tradition, but tradition could be wrong.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
So I would tend to say Bible and reason. We have to kind of try to formulate a theology that that is consistent with the essentials of biblical faith and reason as we now know it. Whether it's belief in evolution, which I think, is compatible with believing in a creator God. Anyway, I'm jabbering on far too much, and
No,
might
it's
want
all
to edit some of the things I've said, perhaps, I don't know, but
no, it's all good. It's all good.
repeat the whole thing.
But you answered my second question too in that. So, but I just wanted to, because I was just going to ask you, for Christians listening who may feel unsettled by this information, what would you say about how this historical understanding can deepen your faith rather than threaten your faith?
I see. Yes.
So,
right.
But
I would say it. One has to revise one's faith, but one doesn't have to give up one's faith. One achieves a more honest faith. That's what I would say. And I believe that God wants us to pursue truth. Well, just think of Jesus in the New Testament. He was probably regarded as a heretic by many people, wasn't he?
Right.
Many people
absolutely.
at the time challenging traditional views.
Absolutely.
So I think that's the right spirit. We can do the same in our own age. Anyway.
This has been, Dr. Day, this has been great. And I really appreciate your expertise, your time with me today. And I know people are going to be blessed and challenged by this too, but I think it's these are necessary conversations that we need to have and open up. So again, truly, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for having me. Goodbye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.